welcome to you, David.
Thank you.
We're here to interview David Seidel, who is one of Australia's best-known jazz bassists with a lifetime of interest in music. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, David.
Thanks very much. Great.
That's really good. One of the things I'm going to ask you to kick off with is that how did you first become interested in jazz?
Well, unlike a lot of other people, I didn't start playing music when I was young. I observed my younger sister and brother learn piano, and my brother learned guitar as well. But I didn't want to be part of it. I didn't want to have any nuns cracking me over the knuckles with a ruler or anything like that. I just didn't want to know about it. And my mother used to tell me, but if you don't learn the piano, you won't be able to ever play another instrument. You have to learn the piano, but I just refused to do it. So I was the oldest in the family, and I just didn't do it. But later on, when I was at high school, I became interested in listening to music on the radio and whatever. And it was pretty much the when the blues influence was coming into rock music with Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix and that kind of thing.
Yep.
And I got right into listening to that. And at that time, my brother was playing guitar and electric bass, and he was going to a teacher who was teaching him all this. So I used to just watch it, and then if nobody would be looking, I'd pick up a guitar and just try to play it. And I picked it up that way. And I also sort of taught myself, what the notes were on the piano, and even how to read music. I taught it to myself when nobody was there, as we lived on a farm in South Australia, which is still there. In fact, we've just come from there the last couple of days ago. If nobody was at home, I would see some music on the piano that Janet might have been playing. And if it was a recognisable tune that I knew the sound of, I could ask her, what note does that start on? And she'd show me. And then I would look at the music and see, well, that note is this one, and that must be C, so C is this one, so it's starting on that one, which is E flat. And I just sort of worked it out if nobody was there.
Yes. So you were sort of a closet musician in a way, were you?
Yeah, and I was also very conscious that my mother said I'll never be able to play a musical instrument because I didn't learn the piano. So I just thought, I'll just work it out myself.
Yeah.
And
so what age would you have been when this was all happening?
I probably was well into high school. I probably would have been about 14 or something like that.
Right.
And then I'd work some things out, and then when some people would come up, I'd ask Janet, is this right? So when you see those notes, two notes like that, they go twice as fast, so it goes da 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 da, and now this one goes da da da, and whatever. I just worked it out from looking at it, and just slowly figured it out. So it's kind of backwards from what anybody else would have, when somebody's actually teaching you something and telling you have to learn this and you have to play this scale and you have to read the music and all that. But I think I ended up learning the same thing.
Yeah, but you did it
to the point of when I got into jazz. One thing was that at the high school, my mother was a high school teacher at the school that we went to at Victor Harbour. And she started producing school musicals. And as it happened, Janet could sing really well, even at that stage. And so she used to always get the lead role. And so they were Broadway shows. They were My Fair Lady, Fiddler on the Roof, things like that.
Yep.
So I would be exposed to those kind of songs that she would be singing, and probably playing the piano herself to learn the songs.
Was your mother musical?
My mother could play the piano a little bit and sing a little bit. She did a bit of everything, She wasn't exactly a musician. My father used to take me to symphony orchestra concerts, but he was no musician. He was a farmer. He'd had to leave school in the Depression after year 7.
Yes.
But he was actually quite well read, and he listened to classical music a lot. In fact, he used to have the ABC playing on an old radiogram in the milking shed. It was a dairy farm, and he would swear that if classical music was playing, that the cows would behave better and they'd give more milk. So this is what he said. So
I've heard that before. Cows are quite musical.
And I later after fiddling around with the guitar a bit, I finally did at some point get an electric guitar, and I didn't have an amplifier, but I found out that I could just put a little wire in the back of this radiogram, and it was a valve radiogram, and it was, in a sense, that's actually what original guitar amplifiers were.
Yeah.
Basically radios. So
Yeah.
I used to plug it into that if nobody. This was always if nobody was there.
Yeah.
I would plug it in and try playing. And,
Yeah. So that was your first instrument was guitar.
yeah, and I was really trying to play blues, and blues leads very easily into jazz, because if you ever would read an interview of Eric Clapton or anybody contemporary of pop music at that time, you would find they'd always refer back to American players,
Yeah.
which would include jazz. So I kind of would read magazines and see stuff like that. And at some point while I was still at high school, I gravitated towards seeing vinyl records that were in the throw-out bin, and they might have cost $1 or something. And Charles Mingus.
Yeah.
I had no idea what
Yeah.
who he was, what it was, but I bought it. And Ahmad Jamal Trio.
Yeah.
I was just totally lucky that I chose
Yeah.
things that were actually turned out to be really good. And so on the farm I would be putting these on the record player and listening to them, and it was like music I'd never heard live, and it just I was just very lucky that the ones I chose, I only had a few records, but they were all modern jazz.
Yes.
But the best one, most of the best records, and I played them until they wore out, So that roundabout way is how I got in.
Going. Well, did you have a career apart from music? Did you study?
Oh no! Well, when I was at high school, I was really. I used to win competitions for essay writing and all that sort of thing, and I actually got. I got offered a cadetship at the Adelaide Advertiser because the editor had read one of my essays that I wrote. But I was very shy, and my mum, he actually sent me a written offer, but it was at the end of year 11, and my mother had always said, you have to go to university and all that. If you take a cadetship with the newspaper, you won't. All that anyway. She put me off it basically, and she said, "And you're too shy. You'd never be pushy enough to be a journalist." So I got offered that, which is quite unusual. I think one of my teachers at school had sent my essay to the editor of the paper or something like that. And anyway, I didn't do that, and I ended up, going to university, and I just did subjects that I was interested in, like politics and things like that. But I didn't last very long because I was already fiddling with music a lot, and so I spent the first year that I was supposed to be at Flinders University, I spent the first year mostly at home trying to teach myself how to play the guitar. And I studied only enough to barely get by, but I found there was a teachers' college, or then called a CAE by that stage, that had a music department, and it was just attached to Flinders University. And somebody told me, or I think I might have known somebody who went there, and so I got an audition to go there. I had to go and audition. I'd take a guitar, and the music lecturers, so asked me to put some music in front of me. Said, "Can you read this?" And I played it, and then they offered me, to go there. So I went there and did music education. Just seemed to be a way that I could stay. I had a scholarship for studying, so I did that. And it so happened that one of the lecturers was the jazz critic for the Advertiser, and he was a clarinet player himself.
What was his name?
His name was Graham Terry. and he was a more of a trad player.
Yeah.
But he used to get us tickets to go to concerts very often because he was the music critic, so he got lots of tickets. And I still remember the first one that I went to. It was in a bit of what was used more as a rock venue, but it was Benny Goodman, and I'd never heard Benny Goodman. I went along to this concert. It was a big crowd, and came out. Joe Pass, guitar, Monty Budwig, bass, Zoot Sims, tenor sax. I can't quite remember who the piano player or the drummer was, but when I heard them play, like, these are the best jazz players in the world at the time, really, and especially Joe Pass. But it left a big impression on me. I thought, this is how well you have to play jazz, you know. Well, maybe I should not worry about it, you know. But I did anyway. I think it inspired me in some way.
So where did you progress from there with your musical career? Because music has really been your career, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, because I had a scholarship, I had to go and do 2 years as a minimum of 2 years as a high school music teacher.
Yes.
So I did that, and I was actually sent to the Barossa Valley, which was quite a good place to go. And in fact, my ancestors were the original inhabitants of the Barossa Valley, so the original settlers. So I think that might have played a part in why they sent me there. Anyway, so I went there and taught music for 2 years there, but I was continuing to play gigs in just ordinary bands, really, you know, in pubs and things like that in Adelaide.
Tell us about some of the people that you played with in those days.
Well, in those days I wasn't playing jazz. I mean, this was the mid-70s, and I wanted to play jazz, but there was never any gigs for me. There were some very good players in Adelaide at that time, very good guitar players, Dave Colton, Graham Conlon, Larry Golder, Jazza Hall. These are all players that played.
Yes.
They did all the gigs. There were bass players. There was Jeff Kluke.
Yes.
There was Jerry Wesley Smith, and several of them.
Yes.
Bob Jeffries, who was a great player. There was a lot of really great musicians in Adelaide. So I used to go and hear them play whenever I could. But the gigs I was doing were more in bands, just playing in restaurants or pubs and playing pop music, playing blues, playing rock, playing. This was all playing guitar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So where did you graduate from there? When did you start playing the bass?
Oh, well, I don't actually know what year it was, but I started playing the bass pretty much after Jeff Kluke moved from Adelaide, and there was a bit of a vacuum there. And I had been playing in quite a few groups with him. I'd been playing guitar. So I got used to what it was like to play with a really good bass player. And so when he left, I'd often find myself on gigs with bass players who weren't quite as good as that. And it used to always be in the back of my mind, I'd really like to be playing the bass, you know, rather than playing guitar and thinking about, I'd really like the bass to sound a bit better than it was, with no disrespect to anybody who
So
it might have been.
were you self-taught on the bass as well, or did you actually have some lessons?
Yeah, no, actually the first day I played the electric bass, I had probably fooled with it because my brother played it.
Yes.
And he'd started playing in some bands, but he was going to medical school at the time, so he did it just, you know, sort of odd jobs, you know, playing, and he'd learnt from a studio musician from Sydney who taught him how to read and taught him how to play from chord symbols and scales and everything like that. He'd learnt all that, so I probably picked it up from just seeing him do it, and I'd play guitar and he'd play the bass, and I'd sort of be noticing what he was doing, you know. So in the back of my mind I kind of knew what the bass was doing.
Yeah.
But as far as actually physically doing it, the first time I did it, I used to go to some workshops. After I'd started teaching, I used to go to some workshops at what was the beginning of a jazz course that started in Adelaide, which was run by an American saxophone player called Hal Hall. And I started going to these workshops, and he would get people in, like Don Burrows came.
Yep.
and he'd have all these students. It was it wasn't an official course really, it was more music education students. You know.
Yep.
But I'd already graduated then, and I was just going there, you know, after hours sort of thing. And Don Burrows was there, and there was no bass player in whatever group we had one day. And he said, "Is there anyone else who could play a bass?" And so, you know, there was an electric bass there, so I said, "Oh, I'll try it." And I played it, and then immediately, after we played a few minutes, he immediately said, well, "You've got a very good feel for the bass. So have you thought about actually playing bass?" So that was a fortunate and helpful thing from Don Burrows.
He gave you a little push along. Does the electric bass have frets on it, or is it?
No, well, it has frets on it, but it is the same notes as
it's the same notes
on this.
Yeah, that's okay. So he was one of your early people that got you into bass.
Yeah,
so
and there's some of the really good Adelaide musicians. There was just a few good rhythm section players had left Adelaide at a certain time, and so I started getting asked to do a lot of gigs, you know, different things, and I did studio work playing electric bass as well, playing on jingles.
Yeah.
You know, there was a guy there called Idris Stearns who wrote the Push Bike song.
Yeah.
He had a recording studio and he used to do jingles, a lot of them for America, and I became the bass player for those, and along there was a drummer who played called Dean Burbeck, who was a terrific drummer.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of experience playing in studios regularly. You know, like sometimes it was even 2 or 3 sessions a day. So I reckon that was probably about 1980.
Yes.
Whatever. And so I was playing electric bass and I was sometimes playing guitar. But then I got into my mind that I wanted to play double bass, because it had always been in the back of my mind. Whenever I listened to jazz records, even when I'd first started getting them, I subconsciously, what I'd always been hearing was this really cool bass sound.
Yes.
Which I later found was bass players playing acoustic bass with gut strings, a warm, deep sound, and that was always in my head.
Yeah.
And and I do remember when I first went to that teachers' college where they had a music library, and I used to go in there and put headphones on and find records. I do remember one of the first ones I put on was Kind of Blue, and I put that on, and I still remember the feeling when I listened to it, the sound of the bass and the drums going. It was just like, I couldn't believe how cool it was, you know, and this deep Paul Chambers playing the bass, Jimmy Cobb playing the drums, and this is just the open sound of it all.
Yeah.
And I had no idea of how to understand it, but I made it my business to sort of find out what modal music was. So I didn't go in by traditional jazz at all. I came from blues to jazz to modern jazz.
Yes.
And then I worked my way around the other way over the years.
Yes. Yeah. That's a sort of the reverse way to do it. Well, of those bass players that you were hearing on records at the time, who were the ones that really influenced you?
Well, the ones that influenced me just because of the records I had were Charles Mingus and Israel Crosby, who played with Ahmed Jamal. And it turns out, you know, they're some of the bass players that I still prefer today because of their very individual sounds. And then there came to be others like Paul Chambers, and then there was Ray Brown, and there were other ones that, you know, you would start listening to. But
Milt Hinton.
Milt Hinton, who I actually became friends with at a later point.
Yes.
And so I was hearing these players, and I didn't really get to experience it until one day somebody was selling a double bass, somebody I knew, and I went and bought this bass. It wasn't anything out of this world, but it was okay, you know. And I bought it, I brought it home, I got in a corner, which is always the best place to play a bass, because sound reflects back to you. I got in the corner, and knowing what the notes were, you know, but they're totally different how you hold it and how you put your fingers. And of course I had no idea, even though I'd been playing with good players, I hadn't really been watching them. and particularly Jeff Clerk. I had played with him a lot, and he was such a terrific player, and still is. But I hadn't been watching him, but I guess I kind of did know. So I just got in the corner and I tentatively just played it, and as soon as I heard the sound of it, I wasn't interested in playing electric bass anymore, just because I wanted this particular tone.
Yes.
Yeah, and it kind of just hooked me straight away.
And you can't get that with an electric bass.
Not really. You can get other good sounds.
Yes,
but you can't get that sound.
Well, how did you go to having an instrument without frets, where I always.
Well, I don't know. I just first of all just haphazardly put my fingers on and just tried to play it as if I was playing electric guitar, bass.
Yes.
But there is a bit different because the strings are a lot longer.
Yes.
On a double bass. Even on this little one, the strings are about at least 40 inches long.
Yes.
On an electric bass, they're 34 inches.
Yes.
So everything's further apart. So when you play down at the bottom of the instrument, your fingers got to be a long way apart.
Yes.
To get the notes. So I first of all tried to play one note per finger, one finger per note rather, on the frets, but it was very hard when you're on the electric bass. When you're on here, you've got no frets, and the notes don't come out quite in tune because your fingers can't stretch far enough, not very easily anyway. But so I quickly got a classical teacher who was John Foster, who was actually originally from Melbourne, but he was the principal bass of the Adelaide Symphony for a long time.
Right.
But he was actually the original bass player in the Australian Jazz Quartet.
With Jack Bockenshire and
with Errol Buddle. And,
yeah.
He was originally in that group, and when they went to America, he didn't go. He got offered the job principal bass in the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra, so he went there.
Yes.
And his brother was a trumpet player called Charlie Foster,
yes,
who was quite famous in Melbourne.
Right, okay. So how long did you have those formal lessons for?
Oh, quite a few years. And he was grooming me to play classical bass and to audition for the symphony orchestra and things like that. But it wasn't really what I wanted to do. But it was very good. So he showed me all the right fingerings and the right way to do everything.
Yes.
But it wasn't anything to do with jazz.
Yes. It was just the classical style to do it. Because I find it amazing, and I still look around and then think, well, how do you know where to put your hands? But
you're given positions to play, and your hands go in a formation like that.
Yes.
And if you do it with the right technique, they'll be in the right spot.
They'll be in the right spot. Yes.
And then you use between your ear and knowing where you are.
Yes.
You find the notes.
So, and there's a little bit of what Stephen Grant calls muscle memory.
Yes.
In other words,
right.
your hands instinctively, because when you're thinking about it, you're sort of three notes ahead of what the progression is. And,
and even I find that I can literally play in my sleep, but I have from time to time been playing where I've been really tired or something like that, and I'm playing and I suddenly realise I've just finished a song. And I haven't been conscious of playing anything, but I must have played it.
Yes.
I'm not saying I've had a...
Yes. No, I know it, but I think that's the key to a really good musician, is that it's so instinctive and you're so with your technique that you just do it. You're not
That's
conscious.
Right. I remember Errol Buddle telling me about a point that he reached when he got to America, where he found that after he used to, for years, always be conscious of what notes he was playing and how to play the right notes for the chord that it was being played, that he reached a point where he heard in his head what he was going to play.
Yes.
And that's the ideal state to be in when you're playing, but it doesn't always happen. But
yes.
When it does happen, it becomes very easy and very enjoyable to play.
Yeah. When I was looking through the database, I looked at some of the people, just the Australian ones that you played with, and I noticed that there are people like Bob Bernard that you're with, and Colin Knoll and Tom Baker. So you want to tell us a little bit about how?
Well, one of the time, Tom Baker, all of these people I met when I first came to Sydney, which I believe was between 1986 and 1987. I had been a couple of times for various reasons, but I had actually come to Sydney for 3 months. I was working for Barry Humphries and doing a show which travelled to Sydney, and then he offered me, would I like to come to Sydney for 3 months? But at that time I was teaching in a jazz course in Adelaide, but not full time. I was just part-time teaching, and I had retired from high school teaching after only 4 years because I was just getting more playing music, and I just didn't want to keep being a school teacher. So just to cut it quickly, I spent 3 months, playing this show at Her Majesty's Theatre with Barry Humphries.
Yes, I'm trying to remember that. Did he have was only you on the bass? Or
No, it was a piano, bass and drums. And the piano player was from Melbourne, but she wasn't a jazz player, she was a classical player called Tommy Kalinsky. And the drummer was called Graham Fisher, who was more of a sort of studio and backing act sort of player.
So what sort of music were you playing?
Well, we were just accompanying Les Patterson if he'd do a novelty song, or Edna to sing a song, and we play some background music. We were actually on stage right there, so when the show would start, Les Patterson would come out and you'd hear him coming from down the corridor, and he'd get into character by going on and going, and making all these foul noises, and he'd come up to the, he'd always come, "How are you, fellas?" and there'd be spit going everywhere. He'd come right up to me. It was a grotesque sight, with all the, makeup of, blood veins and things on his face and he'd be leering and, grinning, and then we'd sort of play something, I think, when he came on, and, he'd come up and talk to us, and then go on and do his act, and he'd do a song, a novelty song. There wasn't much playing involved. In actual fact, part of the reason I took the gig was because I had developed a bit of bad technique on the bass, where I wasn't holding it quite right, and I couldn't get myself out of the habit. And going and playing jazz gigs, as soon as it starts getting difficult, you revert to your old habits. So even though I was going to John Foster and learning the right way to play, I was finding I often didn't put it into practice when I was playing jazz. And then I thought to myself, if I go and do this gig in Sydney, I'll be able to just play the same thing every night, and I can concentrate on playing the correct technique 100% of the time, because it wasn't challenging musically. So that was part of my thinking, which proved to work, because I'm always told by bass players that I've got the perfect hand position, and this sort of.
But a lot of hard work to get to that stage, of course.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, that's really good. Well, it must have been a wonderful experience to work with Barry. Was he an easy person to work with?
As long as everything went well. If anybody screwed anything up, he was not good to be with. But I won't go into the stories. There were a lot of stories, but the point you were making, I lived in Sydney for 3 months while that show was on.
Yes.
And so I used to go to a lot of jazz gigs and meet musicians and often be asked to play. That's when I started playing with Bob Gabbett quite a lot, and other musicians, but they were encouraging me to come to Sydney. That sort of thing was happening.
Yes.
There were all kinds of gigs in those days around King's Cross and around pubs and all kinds of things. So I got that in my mind, and I went on further tours with Barry Humphries and went back to Adelaide, and I was teaching again for a while, and then I just thought I might as well move to Sydney. I just felt like I should do it.
Yeah, the music was there and you wanted to do it. So how did you get playing with Bob Burnett?
Oh, well, Bob Burnett. So when I first came, I was, obviously Janet had already moved to Sydney before that, but we started doing some duo gigs, sometimes trio ones with a drummer or a guitar player.
Yep.
We were doing that a little bit, and sometimes we played in a pub where we were playing in one room and Tom Baker's band was playing in another room with, or maybe they were playing after us or before us or something like that.
Yes.
And he had the group with Don Heap and Lynn Wallace, etc.
Yes.
And so he would come and see us play, and I'd see them play, and then if Don Heap couldn't do a gig, sometimes I'd get asked to do it, and just that kind of thing. And then there were other musicians, other bass players, particularly actually relevant at this time because they both just died, which was Chris Qua and Dee DeVote.
Yes.
I met both of them, and they immediately, especially Chris Qua, both of them, they started giving me their gigs if they were double booked, and which often then there was so much work that people were very often double booked.
Yes.
You know. So my phone used to often ring and be, Chris Qua, you know, can you go and do the pub for me this afternoon? Can you know? So that's how I started getting a lot of work. And the Bob Bernard thing, well, after a few years we did I didn't play with Bob Bernard initially for a few years, but I did play with Tom a little bit, but I was more playing with modern jazz players. I did play with Bernie McGann as well, and Bob Gabbett, those kind of people.
Alan Turnbull, of course.
Yeah, Cole Nolan I didn't play with initially either, but that came a bit later.
Yes.
But you know, these things just come about because of people have got their fixed people they play with. I would have probably played with Cole Nolan because Dee DeVote played with him.
Yes.
And he probably at some point couldn't do a gig and sent me to play.
Yes.
That's how those sort of things came.
He was an interesting keyboard player, wasn't he?
Who, Cole Nolan?
Yeah.
An unbelievable player. Yeah.
Yes.
And I had since even toured with him a little bit with Galapagos. We did a tour where he had to play some Hammond organ and some piano, and John Conley, who played with them, played guitar and played bass. So we were replacing them. So I had to get the guitar out of mothballs and play. But playing with Cole, playing the Hammond organ was something else again, because he would get such an absolutely colossal groove going.
Yes.
If you played guitar with him, you hardly had to do anything because it was just all happening.
It was all swinging.
But he was such a groovy player, like nobody else.
Yeah.
Actually.
Well, if you're playing, did you play bass with him?
Yes. Yeah. That's what I originally did play. It was only just that one time.
Okay. Well, there's a few other people here that I noted down that I didn't know about. People like David McLeod.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he was a singer he was in some shows, and he'd won Star Search or something like that. He'd been on one of those shows on TV at the time, I guess in the 90s, and it was one of those things where you would, if you won the 1 week, you would be back the next week. So some people became sort of stars.
Yes.
Because if they won every time, they'd keep being on the show. You know?
Yeah.
So he was one of those sort of guys, but he was more of a blues and soul sort of singer.
Right.
But he'd been in some musicals like Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat, things like that.
Yeah. And there was little Patty Thompson.
Oh, I did play on her. Yeah, I played on her recording. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I produced that recording. I had got into producing recordings a little bit, but the first one I did was with Janet, which actually John Morrison helped produce it. But I realised along the way, I actually already know a lot of this stuff because I'd been playing on all those jingles, day in, day out for a long time. I was actually quite used to playing in studios, and I hadn't ever really thought that I knew anything about it, but I kind of did.
You sort of.
I couldn't be an engineer, but I knew, I knew what to ask for and how to set things up and how to make things the way I wanted them to record. So our first recordings that we did were done over 2 different periods, but we did these recordings, which eventually became Little Jazzbird, which was the first recording that we put out of Janet.
Yes.
and Bob Bernard heard that, and apparently said to somebody, "Oh, I really like the bass player on that." So, yeah, I would have met him, but I would have only met him just when he's playing at a gig or something, and he always had Wally Wickham, so I didn't ever play with him. You know, Wally was on every gig. So.
Yeah, that's right.
But he was doing it. He had a tour lined up to go to Europe. I think this was 1995, and he had the North Sea Jazz Festival and a few things like that. And so I got on that tour. I got asked to go on that tour.
Right.
Andy Firth was also on that trip.
Yeah.
That was the first time he went overseas.
Yeah.
And
well, you did quite a few overseas tours. At that time, you went to Breda, and of course
Breda.
Breda. That's right. Yes, that's in Holland. Isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's good.
Well, originally I went there with Tom. Tom used to play there every year for a long time. So
that's right.
I think one year I went there and just stayed in a room that he had a hotel room. You know, I stayed there and just looked at things. I might have played a little bit, but I wasn't actually on the festival. I did later go on the festival.
Yeah.
That was with Ben Jones.
Yes.
And he'd started going over there with Tom.
Yep.
That was a bit later.
Yes. Yeah, it's good. Well, some of the overseas people that you've accompanied as well, that you know, people like Del Shannon and.
Yeah, well, because I'd played all kinds of music, I did get, you know, gigs with people that weren't jazz players. So Del Shannon, there was a club opened in Adelaide, and they were bringing acts in. In fact, the first act that we backed was Ricky May.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was playing guitar. Jeff Kluke was the bass player, and Steve Russell was living in Adelaide at that time. He was the piano player, and Rick Kent was the drummer. He was actually a quite well-known drummer too, who played a lot in England. But anyway, we were the group that backed the acts, and so we'd just turn up and have a quick rehearsal, and then we'd play the whole week, or sometimes 2 weeks.
Yes. Were you playing off charts, or they just?
Well, yeah, that was the point. I could sort of read music reasonably well, so that helped me get those gigs. You know,
they just shove a piece of paper and say.
But we didn't have the club scene like Sydney did. We didn't have any of that sort of thing. You'd only really get gigs to back acts as such.
Yeah.
If you were in Sydney, you were doing that all the time. You know.
Yeah.
But in Adelaide, we hardly had that. So Ricky May was actually the first act that I backed. So I turned up with the guitar, and I didn't know what to expect, but he put out all these arrangements, you know, and I was reasonably confident of that. But one of the first things that happened that threw me right off the deep end was he asked the audience for requests, you know, and he did everything off the cuff. He said, you know, somebody requested a song, might have been Misty, and he turned around and said, "Oh, I'll do this just with guitar." And I didn't know all that many tunes at that time. Anyway, whatever tune it was, I didn't know it, and I was sort of whispering to him, "I don't really know it." And he's going, "You'll be right, just follow me." And so I had to play, and they were very exposed, you know, playing guitar and trying to follow him, you know, and not really knowing the song properly. That's a real fear moment, a fearful moment.
Yeah, that puts certainly bits of pressure on you.
Yeah.
Well, there's some few others that you did. I noticed there, Mundell Lowe was one of the ones that you mentioned there with it.
That's right. And I had listened to him a lot. He was a very famous guitarist. He was very famous for the...
He played with Andre Previn, didn't he?
Yeah, he did, and he also played with Sarah Vaughan on a famous record with just guitar and bass. I'd listened to a lot of that stuff. I also had a bit of an awkward moment with him because I was fairly confident, you know, that if I didn't know a tune, if it was a guitarist playing, that I could see what they were playing, and if there was a song I didn't know, I was fairly confident that I could see what he was going to play next, and I might be able to fake it a bit. And the first tune that he called was a tune that I didn't know. or didn't know well. So I'm thinking, I said, okay, because I could have said, no, I don't know it, but I didn't want to say that. And so he starts playing. The first note he hit, I thought was a G, and I hit the G, and it was the wrong note. And I quickly found the right note, but I later found out that he played with a funny tuning. He played with a lowered bottom string. He had a D instead of an E. Right. So if he played a note, it was a tone lower than what I thought it was to look. So I worked it out immediately, but I had to then modify everything I saw. If I saw him hitting the bottom string, and that it might be the bass note, I had to transpose it.
This is where your professionalism and experience comes into it, well, because I can imagine it'd be
this is just fakery, but when you get through something like that, you tend to remember everything if you've thrown in at the deep end.
Now, probably the major influence in your life was your sister Janet, and the trio that you did with them. So tell us a little bit about that. That
started in Adelaide. I didn't work with her much when we were young. I did a little bit. She used to do folk singing a little bit. When I first started playing guitar, I used to sometimes back her up with that. And she was influenced by Judith Durham quite a lot.
Yes.
In that pure sort of way of singing.
Yes.
Which did affect the way she sang jazz too, which she didn't really sing like jazz singers as such. In style, the sound wise.
Yes.
So over the years, she actually ended up getting a gig in Adelaide in a piano bar. It was in those piano bar times, and it was in the days of Ansett when they owned a lot of hotels, and there was a Danish manager of this Gateway Hotel in Adelaide, which was where all politicians and sports stars stayed and all that kind of thing. And the manager was very hip, and he asked her, would you like to play with a trio? So we got a gig 3 nights a week. It was a late night gig from 10 till 2. So people would come there. It was right in the middle of the city. People would come there after going to the movies or things like that. And we'd often have musicians coming and sitting in. Musicians like Schmo, Bob Jeffries, really good Adelaide players, and they'd come just somewhere to play. And we had the terrific drummer Billy Ross, who had also worked in Melbourne a lot. He was in the famous group that played at the Embers when it was at its height. So we had a very fortunate period of time where we played there.
So how long were you there for?
I don't know whether it might have been a couple of years, maybe two or three years.
3 nights a week.
Yeah, and it was a very good gig. We've had some of our best gigs in Melbourne. I've always found the audiences totally different in Melbourne than Sydney, which is strange. It's a strange phenomenon, but we always found people more receptive to our music in Melbourne than Sydney, and more knowledgeable. And we had a lot of good experiences playing at the Melbourne Recital Centre. But even before that, we'd come for Diana Allen, and we'd also come for when the Syncopators, when Peter Gordian first had that venue, we came, and it was just our first venture into playing in Melbourne. And it was always a great pleasure to do it. And I remember going on the ABC in Melbourne and going on the Bert Newton show, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go and play live on TV and things like that. And there were times where I reckon we came to Melbourne more often, played more often in Melbourne than we did in Sydney.
Yes.
At times, And aside from going to Japan, which is the perfect place to go and do gigs.
Yes, and they're very appreciative, aren't they?
Yeah, and they do everything. It's just totally professional.
Yes.
The world looks rosy at sundown, where a loving smile will meet me and always greet me at sundown. I seem to sigh